George S. Patton was convinced that he himself had fought and perished in numerous previous wars. Now reincarnated, he was a soldier reborn. He told aides he had fought as a Roman legionnaire, a medieval knight, and a Napoleonic marshal, and he treated the déjà vu he felt on historic battlefields as proof. He carried this obsession with destiny into his daily habits. He demanded his helmet be polished until it glared in the sun, because, of course, the shine projected authority. He also had a custom-tailored uniform made, trimmed with brass buttons and high boots for the same reason. In combat zones, he ordered troops to stage full parades, boots polished and belts gleaming, because he believed ceremony built discipline, and his speeches were notorious, filled with blunt language and profanity, which would energize the troops but offended dignitaries. Once in Sicily in 1943, he slapped two exhausted soldiers in field hospitals, cursed them as cowards, and ordered them back to the front, explaining later that fear was contagious and needed to be stamped out, with violence if necessary. Ungern-Sternberg was a White Russian general who, during the Russian Civil War, led his forces into Mongolia and declared himself the reincarnation of Genghis Khan. In 1920, he installed himself as ruler and announced plans to restore the Mongol Empire. His troops were ordered to take part in religious practices. Officers had to bow before Buddhist statues, and prayers were performed before campaigns. He wore amulets in battle and demanded that horoscopes be consulted when deciding punishments or planning actions. Executions were sometimes staged as ritual sacrifices, often targeting perceived enemies because he believed bloodshed would purify his men. He also required loyalty ceremonies in which soldiers swore oaths to him personally. For several months, he held control in Mongolia under these practices. That is, until 1921, when his own men captured him and turned him over to the Soviets, who executed him after a public trial. Thomas Stonewall Jackson's reputation as a Civil War genius was matched by his eccentric personal habits. Deeply religious, he believed every action had spiritual weight. He held one arm aloft while marching or in battle because he thought it improved blood circulation and kept his body balanced. He avoided pepper, convinced it weakened his legs, and ate only plain food like bread and milk to keep his body pure. He refused to fight on Sundays unless absolutely necessary, even in the middle of active campaigns, and his men knew he might suddenly halt operations to observe the Sabbath. He was known to pray constantly, even in the saddle, sometimes with his eyes closed while riding. Jackson's intensity carried into his command style. He drove his soldiers through exhausting 30-mile marches, but also outmaneuvered much larger Union forces in the Shenandoah Valley. His quirks, fueled by religious conviction, became part of the legend that made his men both respect and fear him. William Sherman began the Civil War in a state that alarmed both colleagues and newspapers. In late 1861, convinced that Confederate forces in Kentucky outnumbered Union troops by the tens of thousands, he described the situation as hopeless and fell into desperation. He chain-smoked, paced endlessly, and talked of disasters that weren't real. A Cincinnati paper branded him insane, and he was relieved of command. After several months of leave and reassignment, he reemerged with new energy. By 1864, he was leading massive campaigns and developed the doctrine of hard war, focused on breaking not just armies, but the enemy's will to fight. In his March to the Sea, he ordered railroads twisted into Sherman's neckties, crops burned, and factories dismantled, leaving swaths of Georgia devastated. Soldiers who once saw him as unstable now followed a commander who combined relentless discipline with a cold disregard for civilian property. The transition from anxious collapse to ruthless precision made Sherman's career one of the strangest transformations of the war. Adrian Carton de Wert's life as a general was defined by injury and survival. He was shot in the face in World War I, losing an eye and part of his ear, and later lost his left hand when it was shattered by shrapnel. He tore off the bandages himself when doctors hesitated to amputate the ruined fingers, insisting on immediate surgery. Over the course of his service, he was wounded in the stomach, hip, leg, and ankle, yet returned to duty every time. In World War II, he survived a plane crash in the Mediterranean, swam to shore despite a broken back, and was captured by Italians. As a prisoner, he tried to escape repeatedly, once digging a tunnel with fellow officers for months before being caught. Despite missing an eye and pinned-up sleeve, he commanded with energy, brushing off his wounds as minor inconveniences. In his memoir, he summed it up with one line: "Frankly, I had enjoyed the war." His casual attitude toward life-threatening injuries set him apart from any other commander. Yamamoto Kansuke was a 16th-century samurai general who overcame severe disabilities. He was blind in one eye and had a crippled leg, making him unfit for sword fighting, so he devoted himself to tactics. Serving the warlord Takeda Shingen, Yamamoto Kansuke became known for daring and complex strategies. He drilled soldiers in ambushes and night attacks, and emphasized mobility over brute force. At the four battles of Kawanakajima in 1561, he proposed dividing Takeda's army in two, luring Uesugi Kenshin into a trap. When part of the plan failed, Yamamoto Kansuke, already in his 50s, led a direct assault with his retainers, charging into the enemy line. He was cut down in the fighting, but the chaos his charge caused allowed Takeda to stabilize the battle. Chronicles say he expected to lose his life and believed his sacrifice would ensure victory. Yamamoto Kansuke's mix of physical disability, innovative planning, and deliberate self-destruction made him one of the strangest figures among Japan's Sengoku-era generals. Pyrrhus of Epirus was a Greek general whose victories made cautionary lessons. A cousin of Alexander the Great, he was praised for his bravery, but criticized for reckless ambition. Obsessed with elephants, he imported them from the Hellenistic kingdoms and fielded them in Italy and Greece, often more for spectacle than practicality. Against Rome, he scored victories at Heraclea in 280 BC and Esculum in 279 BC. But his own losses were so heavy that he admitted, "If we are victorious in one more battle with the Romans, we shall be utterly ruined." His name gave rise to the phrase Pyrrhic victory, meaning a win too costly to matter. Pyrrhus also shifted theaters constantly. He fought in Italy, Sicily, Macedonia, and Greece, frequently abandoning allies mid-campaign to pursue new battles. His fascination with war for its own sake puzzled contemporaries, who saw little lasting political gain from his efforts. His fixation on victory at any price, even ruinous ones, made him one of the most unusual generals of the ancient world. Žižka started his military career as a minor Czech noble and mercenary, but rose in prominence during the Hussite Wars in the early 1400s. What made him so unusual was that he became an undefeated general, despite steadily losing his sight. By the time he commanded the Hussite armies, he had already lost one eye. Around 1421, he lost the other, leaving him completely blind. Yet he continued to lead, issuing orders through aides and relying on an extraordinary memory for terrain. His armies were built around wagon forts, wooden carts reinforced with planks, fitted with small cannons or crossbows, and chained together into mobile fortresses. This mix of farm equipment and firepower gave peasants the ability to withstand heavy cavalry. He also trained his men in sudden ambushes and hit-and-run attacks, drilling them with discipline uncommon for militias. Contemporary enemies mocked his blindness, only to be routed by his forces. Alexander Suvorov was one of Russia's most successful commanders, but his personal habits made him seem eccentric even by 18th century standards. He rejected luxury, sleeping on straw, bathing in cold water, and eating simple porridge instead of the lavish meals expected of a field marshal. He wore plain clothes rather than ornate uniforms, sometimes turning up in peasant shirts or boots that shocked fellow officers. Suvorov insisted on physical drills well into his 60s, running alongside troops, climbing hills, and rolling in the snow to toughen himself. He trained soldiers with unusual methods, encouraging speed, bayonet fighting, and improvisation rather than rigid parade ground routines. His book, The Science of Victory, presented war as common sense, full of short proverbs and blunt advice like, "The bullet is a fool. The bayonet is a fine chap." His odd mix of ascetic lifestyle and homespun military philosophy contrasted with the pomp of other Russian generals. Despite his quirks, he never lost a major battle, making him both strange and legendary. Gilles was celebrated in his youth as one of Joan of Arc's most loyal commanders. A Marshal of France, he led troops in key victories during the 100 Years' War and was admired for bravery and lavish generosity. After Joan's execution, however, his life took a bizarre turn. He withdrew from active campaigns, built a private theater troupe at enormous expense, and surrounded himself with astrologers and alchemists. He became obsessed with transmutation, rituals, and summoning spirits, spending much of his fortune on occult experiments. At the same time, he lured children to his estates under false pretenses. Later testimony accused him of grotesque crimes, mixing ritual, violence, and superstition. In 1440, French authorities tried and condemned him for heresy, sodomy, and murder. His downfall shocked Europe. As a national hero, he had turned into an infamous criminal. Charles Gordon, known as Chinese Gordon for his service in the Taiping Rebellion, was a British general whose career was shaped by deep religious conviction. He lived simply, often giving away his salary, and decorated his quarters with Bible verses rather than military trophies. He claimed to be directly guided by God in both personal and military decisions, believing that divine will shaped his assignments. In China, he refused bribes and insisted on strict discipline, an unusual stance for mercenary-style services in the 1860s. Later, as Governor-General of Sudan, he became famous for fighting slavery while living an ascetic life, sleeping on mats and eating plain meals. His eccentric piety reached its peak at Khartoum in 1884–85, when he refused repeated orders to evacuate despite overwhelming odds. He stayed behind, reading scripture and writing letters about destiny until the city was overrun and he lost his life. Gordon's odd mix of mysticism, charity, and defiance marked him as a general who lived and died according to his personal vision of God's plan. Nogi Maresuke was a Japanese general whose life and death were defined by extreme ideas of loyalty. He first rose to fame in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904–1905, commanding during the siege of Port Arthur. His troops eventually forced the Russians to surrender, but at the cost of tens of thousands of Japanese lives. Nogi blamed himself for the heavy casualties and asked Emperor Meiji for permission to commit seppuku. The emperor refused, insisting he continue to serve. For years afterward, Nogi lived under a cloud of guilt, writing that he wished to end his life. When Emperor Meiji passed away in 1912, Nogi saw the moment as his release. He and his wife performed junshi, the ritual of taking one's own life after the Lord passes away. On the day of the emperor's funeral, he plunged his sword into his stomach while his wife slit her own throat. The act shocked modern Japan, which had been trying to move away from these feudal traditions. Joachim Murat, Napoleon's brother-in-law and a Marshal of France, was known as much for his flamboyance as for his courage. A cavalry commander, he never entered battle in ordinary uniform. Instead, he appeared in velvet jackets, embroidered coats, and trousers trimmed with gold, often topped with enormous plumes and jewelry. His outfits were so extravagant that enemies sometimes mistook him for a ceremonial figure rather than a field officer. Murat wasn't just eccentric in dress. He loved to lead charges personally, galloping ahead of his men with dramatic flair, often waving his sword high. His bravery was unquestioned, but his recklessness sometimes bordered on foolishness, placing him in needless danger. After Napoleon made him King of Naples, Murat continued to dress like a dandy on the battlefield, which earned him both admiration and mockery. To his soldiers, his style embodied swagger and daring, but to his peers, it looked like theater. Few generals ever combined military command with such showmanship. Michel Ney, another of Napoleon's marshals, earned the nickname the bravest of the brave for his habit of throwing himself directly in the thickest fighting. At Eylau, he led cavalry charges in blizzard conditions. At Waterloo, long after defeat was certain, he repeatedly rode into British lines, losing horse after horse beneath him until he fought on foot with a broken sword. Ney was known for his fiery temper and impulsive decisions, often contradicting Napoleon's careful planning with reckless aggression. His dramatic presence inspired troops, but his refusal to retreat, even when outnumbered, sometimes turned victories into heavy losses. After Napoleon's final fall, Ney was captured and executed by firing squad in 1815. Even at his death, he remained defiant, telling the soldiers ordered to shoot him, "Soldiers, when I give the command to fire, fire straight at my heart." His theatrical bravery defined him as one of the strangest commanders of his time. Daniel Sickles was a Union general whose life mixed politics, scandal, and recklessness. Before the Civil War, he became infamous in Washington for taking the life of his wife's lover, the son of Francis Scott Key, in broad daylight near the White House. His lawyers argued temporary insanity, and he became the first American to be acquitted with that defense. Despite the scandal, he was appointed general and given command in the Army of the Potomac. At Gettysburg in 1863, Sickles defied orders and marched his troops a mile ahead of the Union line into exposed ground. His men were nearly destroyed, but the stand helped slow the Confederate attack. During the battle, his leg was shattered by cannon fire and amputated. Instead of retreating quietly, he donated the leg to an Army medical museum, where it was displayed in a case. He reportedly visited it for years afterward. Few generals combined personal scandal, reckless insubordination, and a willingness to turn their own amputation into a public display. James Wilkinson's military career was strange less for bravery than for duplicity. He served as a general in the U.S. Army in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but secretly took money from Spain while still in uniform. He passed intelligence to Spain officials and encouraged Kentucky settlers to break away from the United States. Even while serving as the U.S. Army's senior officer, he was known to send coded letters to Spanish agents signed with the alias Number 13. His double dealing didn't stop there. He was also involved in Aaron Burr's conspiracy, though he later testified against Burr to save himself. Wilkinson's constant betrayals baffled contemporaries, who could never be certain whose side he was on. Despite repeated investigations, he managed to hold command positions for decades. A general who spent much of his career working against his own country while pretending to serve it, Wilkinson is one of the oddest and least trustworthy figures to ever wear the American uniform. Francisco Solano López was Paraguay's president and marshal, and His decisions nearly destroyed the country. Obsessed with military glory, he built a massive army for a small nation and believed he could dominate South America. In 1864, he launched the War of the Triple Alliance against Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay simultaneously. López ignored the fact that Paraguay was outnumbered and outproduced in every category. He demanded total loyalty, executing officers he suspected of disloyalty, and ordering civilians to fight when manpower ran out. His personal quirks showed in his relationships. He wore a French-style uniform, decorated with medals, and carried himself as if he were Napoleon reborn. The war was catastrophic. Paraguay lost much of its male population and vast amounts of territory. Even as the country collapsed, López refused to surrender, fighting until his life was taken in 1870 while trying to rally a handful of soldiers. His delusional overconfidence turned a minor nation into a battlefield and marked him as one of history's strangest generals. Quintus Servilius Capio was a Roman general with a disastrous ego. In 105 BC, Rome faced migrating tribes of Cimbri and Teutones near Arusio in southern Gaul. Capio shared command with a newer, less aristocratic consul, Gnatius Malleus Maximus. Capio despised him for being a new man, without noble birth, and refused to cooperate. Instead of uniting their forces, Capio camped separately, leaving the Roman armies divided and exposed. When battle came, his troops were destroyed first, and Malleus's men were quickly overwhelmed. As many as 80,000 Roman soldiers perished in one of the Republic's worst defeats. Afterward, Capio was blamed not only for arrogance, but also for suspiciously losing vast amounts of captured gold, which some accused him of stealing. Tried in Rome, he was stripped of rank and exiled. His strange combination of pride, incompetence, and possible corruption left him infamous. Few generals in Roman history managed to turn personal vanity into such a colossal military disaster. Vo Nguyen Giap, who led Vietnamese forces against both the French and the Americans, stood out for the unusual way he mixed warfare with philosophy. Originally a teacher and a journalist, he wrote poetry and studied law before becoming a self-taught general. In training camps, he required soldiers to recite patriotic poetry and political texts, treating education as part of military duty. He lived in austere conditions alongside his men, rejecting the luxuries that many commanders enjoyed, and insisted that officers share the same food and hardships as peasants. Giap relied heavily on patience and surprise, orchestrating long campaigns where discipline and morale mattered as much as firepower. At Dien Bien Phu in 1954, he directed the hauling of artillery through jungle and mountains by sheer manpower, surrounding the French in a place they thought secure. His fusion of guerrilla tactics with moral and cultural discipline was unlike any other modern commander. Giap's odd blend of teacher, poet, and general earned him a reputation as both strange and formidable. William Hull's command in the War of 1812 became one of the most embarrassing episodes in American military history. Appointed brigadier general, he was tasked with invading Canada. Instead, Hull hesitated, worried about Native American allies fighting with the British, and convinced himself he was badly outnumbered. For weeks, his army sat idle while morale collapsed. In August 1812, when British forces under General Isaac Brock and Tecumseh's warriors approached Detroit, Hull panicked. Without a major battle, he surrendered the entire garrison of more than 2,000 men alongside with weapons and supplies. His troops were stunned. They expected to fight, and many thought they had the advantage. Hull's decision was so strange that contemporaries accused him of cowardice or treason. He was court-martialed, found guilty of neglect of duty, and sentenced to death, though President Madison spared him. Hull's excessive fear and refusal to fight marked him as one of the strangest failures to ever lead an American army. It's weird to see the weirdness of these generals. Some thought they had divine inspiration, others were just a bit flamboyant, while some were just plain cowards. What do you think? Who's the weirdest on this list? And also, I'd like to hear what other type of weird people you'd like to hear about. We'd love to make another video like this one. And if you're still around, please leave us a like and subscribe and hit the notification bell to hear about new videos when we come out with them. In fact, there should be another video on your screen right now that YouTube thinks you might like, so check it out. Thanks for watching. See you next time.